Welcome to Dream Loudly, an I Impossible original show. We are your hosts, Micah Lancaster and Bryce Stanhope. And today we're going to go into the world of shooting coaches and shooting knowledge. And we're going to get a little bit confrontational here, but we're not trying to be disrespectful. What we're trying to do is discuss the concepts of shooting. And we're asking for change. We're asking for growth in this industry and in this field. And so the topic today is what's wrong with shooting coaches. And so as we dive into this topic, we have three main topics to go over. The first one is simply that shooting coaches are ignoring real players. Bryce, why don't you start by diving into that one?
So I think the thing with players that they have a struggle with is when one, like they'll first bring up their age. They're older. Two would be that they use their kind of status against them, where they're like, well, that's Steph Curry. That's just how Steph shoots. People love to call him an alien. And when their own philosophies don't line up with what they see players are doing, they kind of in their own head, they go, that's just not the right way to shoot the basketball. And I think that's also a trend in the basketball world that we see is everybody wants to be like, well, all these guys are doing things wrong. This is how the game was actually meant to be played. So I think that's what we see with shooting coaches a lot is when their philosophies don't line up with what great shooters are actually doing, they have to draw that line of, well, that's just what they do. That's not how a normal kid could shoot. Which I could pull up a ton of videos of young players, 5th, 6th grade, that shoot more like a Steph Curry at a young age, but then they try to take that away from them as they kind of grow up. So I think that's one of the things for me that I would say that I'm seeing with shooting coaches the most is they're disregarding what great shooters are actually doing because the philosophies and what those players actually do, they just don't line up.
Yeah, and that's where we have the most disagreements with shooting coaches on this is because we're really big on training off of what we actually see players do. And so, yes, there's sometimes to get ahead of the game where you can see where the game is headed. You can see some footwork that's possible, and you can basically, create training methods and things of where you think the game is going. And so you can kind of get ahead of it that way. But that's not what we're seeing in shooting coaches. We're seeing a stubbornness of this is where shooting has always been, and this is where it should stay. And so even if we're talking about shooting methods, maybe they create a new drill. The new drill is still designed to teach outdated things. And that's the main thing, is they're ignoring the trends. And so the biggest thing is, and we talk about this all the time, is that there is a rebellious spirit or even a, breaking out of the mold that happens with great players. And so they don't even necessarily know they're doing it. So the greatest example of this would be Steph Curry. If Steph Curry was to teach you to shoot, he would sound a lot like shooting coaches. He would tell you to have a gap between the ball and his palm. He would tell you to probably keep the elbow pretty straight. If you look at Steph shooting the basketball, he doesn't follow those rules. So whether or not he knew it or not, he rebelled against the system. He found his own shot. And you could say the same thing about Clay. He also found his own shot. But the shot that they have found have a lot of very similar qualities to each other. And so even though they have found their own way to shoot, they've all fit the same trends. And so we've pinpointed this trend quite a bit. Their guide hands tend to be towards the top of the basketball where their fingers are. Their elbows seem to, or typically have a nice flared angle to it. Not perfectly straight, not really bowed out, but a nice comfortable angle of it. And most players don't have a gap between the ball and their palm. And so if everyone seems to have steered themselves away from the traditional way to shoot, and they've all found similar trends, why wouldn't we start there with players? And so the biggest problem that we see with shooting coaches is they basically try to take players and they put them in the prototypical box and they make them start there. And the problem is not a lot of players are going to be comfortable with that.
And they don't get out of it either. Once they're stuck there, they're stuck there.
Because they've been told to shoot like that. They're trying to fit into those rules. And so now they're kind of stuck. If you start them with the trends, then you can start to say, okay, maybe your hand shouldn't be quite at the top. We can slide it down a little bit. Maybe your elbow might be a little bit more comfortable here. If you start them with the trends, you're more than likely going to get closer to the end product right from the start. And so that's the biggest thing when we're talking about, ignoring real results, is that this is actually where we can actually see the most comfort for people. So just to ask you a question to go along with this, how many players in today's game actually shoot the ball the way that most shooting coaches would teach it.
I mean, in all honesty, the last player I can think about that, like when I look at their shot, I'm like, oh, that's what some people would call textbook, the Matt Bonner. Matt Bonner was 10 toes square, elbow was probably at a pure, like I don't know what you call that, 90 degree, straight up, straight down. He was probably one of the last ones that we really saw that had those old school style taught mechanics. You don't see it. Even when you look at Clay, people love to use Clay as like, oh, Clay's shot is just textbook. He's just very balanced. His toes are still turned. His hand, the ball sits all the way down into it. There's no actual gap. And I think this is one of the things that we talk about that people have to get a better understanding of is the ball actually can't even touch your palm. That's why we don't have to have a forced gap where we prop it up. Now, some players do. A Tyler Hero is a little bit grippier, has a little bit more of a look of a forced gap. JJ Redick, same thing, a little grippier, a little more forced gap. But most players, like we said, we follow those trends. We see what players do. They just let the ball rest in their hand the way their hand is basically shaped. Now, some people, because that muscle there, it might look like that's just the shape of the hand. We talk about it all the time. If you just put a ball in your hands, you typically will let it rest. It's just players do that, and then they're like, oh, I got to create a gap. It's in those same two videos as Steph and Clay. They're teaching shooting. They're almost spot on to their shots, and then they go, oh, and then I make a gap right here too. I make sure it doesn't touch my palm. So it's just one of those things where I think, I think a lot of players have a trouble teaching what they do because they might not even truly know their self. It's just they found it. They found that comfort level. They figured out what works for them and where it is. And then it's one of my favorite topics is, most players shoot more alike than they do different. The big things that make your shot look different is lift points. So, we look at a KD shooting from, a foot above his head. That's an extended high lift point. It looks structurally way different than Steph. But if I took his mechanics and that technique down to a medium lift point, it would almost look identical to Steph. It wouldn't look that different. So that aesthetic of it that people are like, everybody shoots different to an extent. Like you said, it's one of the things that we're not a huge fan of with a lot of shooting coaches is they have a lot of rules you have to fit in between. We more so have guidelines. Like, okay, Steph's hand's more at the top. Kawhi's hand is actually over the top because his hands are so big. And then you have Clay who's a little lower. The only person I can think of who has a really, really low offhand that I would consider side of the ball would be Kevin Durant. But it's because his hands are so big that his shooting hand itself covers most of the ball anyway. So I think that's one of the things that, shooting coaches are struggling with is, getting outside of needing these rules that players have to fit into and start actually seeing the trends and having more guidelines so players can find their own comfort within what your rules would be.
Yeah, and that's the main topic here is that you're not basing your philosophies off of what we're actually seeing. Because when we say things like, hey, what about Steph? They'll say, oh, don't worry about Steph.
Yeah,
people can't shoot like Steph.
That's just Steph.
Oh, that's just Dame. That's just Clay. That's just Ray. Like, there's no evidence for them to give us except their philosophy itself, that this is the optimal way to shoot the basketball.
Most hated word.
And you love that word, and I'm going to continue saying it all the time just to drive you crazy. But if there was an optimal way to shoot it, even if that was true, that the optimal way to shoot the basketball would be keeping my elbow really straight. The optimal way to shoot the basketball would be keeping the ball really tight to my body. The optimal way to shoot the basketball, if I followed all these rules, my body still has to fit that optimal way. And what they're not noticing is that most people's bodies won't fit it. And so a lot of these shooting philosophies are still based on what it used to be. So let's say, we take it off of a 5'11" player with a 5'11" wingspan.
Yep.
If that player could fit that so-called rule book and shoot the ball well, great.
Awesome.
But the problem is what do you do with the 6'4" player with the 7'3" wingspan that we just trained?
Yeah.
They're not going to fit that same so-called rule book of training. And so that's why you have to base it off of different trends and not just base it off of rules. Yeah. Because it's not going to work for everybody.
And kind of what I'd say to wrap up number one would be, I think we got to get rid of the idea of optimal and start understanding functional. Because what might be optimal when nobody's guarding me, I'm just in my own space shooting in a gym, probably also doesn't quite fit the mold of what's going to be functional for the functionality of the game. And that's where you notice a lot of players struggle shooting more in-game style shots is to have that time to, pull the ball close to my body, tap my hip, get my elbow back behind me and do this. Probably isn't the most functional way for me to shoot. Because I know you, same as me, you look at the way a lot of these athletes are built nowadays. to take the ball, pull it back into my body. Even me, this chair stopping me from blowing back, I can already feel my shoulder bunching up where it's like it's not liking that. And I think that's where functional shooting needs to start to become more of the trend and not what people think from a scientific point is optimal when players just don't do it.
Yeah, and if we were to shoot like nonstop alone and a player can make, let's say you're a motivational speaker and you can make 800 shots in a row shooting very slow, very mechanical, and the ball happens to go in the basket. Doesn't mean it's going to work in the game.
Yeah.
So optimal doesn't always mean will work in the game. It's just basically saying this will make the ball go in the basket.
Yeah.
And it, like we said, doesn't work for everybody. So the second one would be on our list is that shooting coaches are teaching one way to shoot. Now that sounds similar to what we just talked about. It's based off of their made-up philosophy.
Yeah.
But this can actually go deeper than what we just said.
Yeah.
So we're talking about them teaching just one way to shoot. How would you best sum that up?
I mean, they're teaching set shots and spot shots. Because I think some people's philosophies do stem from they look at the greater realm of basketball of the players all the way around the world is most of them can't knock down a set shot. I'm wide open and just hit this. But I still think the problem with those philosophies, I don't care if you're talking about shooting, ball handling, finishing, you are cutting out a group of players that want to be more than just a set shooter. They want to be able to, hit the fadeaway. They want to be able to create a shot for themselves, hit a step back, hit this. Those take different techniques. And so when they get stuck in this one way of shooting of like every way you shoot, every shot has to look the same as the old school saying.
Well, that's the main myth that we're always hearing is people will say every shot has to be the same.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what we're talking about. So it can't be.
Yeah.
Not if you want to be able to have the ability to adapt.
Yep.
But keep going on that.
So your techniques have to be different at that point. So you look at techniques, and we've been having this conversation lately, and like even for us, like we've always talked about this with our system, it's always growing. We don't have a set of rules in place for ball hand footwork, and this is how it's going to be forever. It's going to change. Game's going to adapt. Game's going to change. We're getting guys like Wembanyama who are 7'6" that are adapting to the way the game is played now. If you were Wembanyama back in the 80s, 90s, how would he be playing? You're posting up. Like that's it. That's all you have. You're Sean Bradley. So with players like that ability to adapt, different lift points, different styles of shots. You have fadeaways, you have set shots, you have elevation shots. We're seeing split landings more now. We're seeing players that are coming out and just shooting the ball because chances are they haven't really had a shooting coach. They learned how to shoot the more natural way by just going out there and getting up shots. And that works for some. Some players do need shooting coaches, and we know that. But I think with players, the biggest thing is that adaptability to change lift points. We've talked about this with Steph. The only true thing Steph's missing in his shooting game, the ability to shoot a real pull-up, higher lift point elevation shot, which, again, he's become a specialist in that lower lift point, that medium lift point, where he either needs to have space or create space. But we've seen it. NBA Finals being guarded by Kevin Love. Kevin Love knows you have to shoot a three. He's just going to get as tight to you as he can because you can't get that shot off with that lower lift point. Happened in the All-Star game, which is more of a fun game, but they trapped him in the corner at the end of the game. He can't get a shot off over a LeBron, over I think it might have been Anthony Davis at that time, because he can't get those higher lift points. Then you have his brother, and you did a great post on this a while back, where his brother, same height, same size, same athleticism, can shoot a real pull-up because he can change his lift point, and that's just something Steph never naturally picked up himself. So it's not to say that, does Steph need it? No. But if he had it, crazy player.
It would still elevate his game to another level.
Take it to a different level.
And maybe the concern of that for Steph would be he doesn't want to mess with what he has. Mm-hmm. And some people do have fears of that, especially if your shot's that good. I don't even want to shoot a different way.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of this, too, is that it's also the analytical side of the game now, where the mid-range game is being so crapped on.
Being held back. Yeah.
That players aren't even wanting to add that lift point to their game because they think they're not even going to use it.
But we've talked about this. Almost every All-Star scores out the mid-range.
They have the ability to shoot the mid-range. Yep. And
Chris Paul.
The biggest, when we talk about Steph, is people use Steph as an example of how not to shoot. And they'll say things like Steph shoots from his hip because they don't understand lift points.
Crazy.
And so what happens then, and I'll use myself as an example of this, when I was in high school, I led the state in three-point percentage my senior year. I was 52% from the three-point line. I shot a medium lift point. A lot of it was because that's how I always shot growing up. I didn't really change my shot all that much, but I was a really good three-point shooter. And then when I get to college, my college staff wants to change my shot because, as they always say, this shot won't work at the college level. And so I had to go through a way to relearn how to shoot the basketball. Now, my freshman year, I went through some shooting woes a little bit from the three-point line. I eventually developed a good three-point shot, but you saw I had to elevate on that shot. I had to find a high lift point jump shot from the three-point line, which was hard. That was a harder shot to master, and I don't think I ever got back the brilliance of my high school shot that I had.
And what percentage did you shoot from the three in high school?
52%. And it's not like that shot would have changed all that much at the college level. I would have got stronger. I could have kept the medium lift point, just like we're seeing players like Steph do. Or players who are even lower, like a Cade Cunningham, who's shooting a low lift point three.
Yeah, real low for his height.
Ja Morant, low lift point three. And so what people don't understand is that I can shoot that medium lift point from that three-point line, and when I need it, when I actually have a contest, then I would have had the ability to adapt to a high lift point jump shot. But I don't need to shoot the mid-range and the three-point shot the exact same way. And that's the biggest issue that we're seeing with that.
And that's what we've been talking about this week, of where like I'm even thinking about this more and more, is like changing lift points to me isn't really changing mechanics. Because my hand placement's still the same. My elbows are still in the same spot. You know, I might be using my legs different if I'm elevating, but those are just different techniques. Like, that's truly, to me, what makes Kyrie so special, is on every level of skill. We're always talking about his ball handling, his footwork. I think the one thing that doesn't get enough shine sometimes is his shot. His ability to shoot from lower and medium lift points for range, and his ability to shoot a real pull-up, which obviously he talks a lot about Kobe with that stuff. He'll raise into a high to an extended high. This is why we see him hit game winners. Again, we saw it in the finals against Steph Curry. Slide step to the right, gets contested, raises his lift point to shoot over somebody. He's not thinking about that as he plays, though. He's just trained it. He's adapted to it, and he just makes the necessary adjustment when the time calls for it. It's not like a player learning multiple lift points is going to, pull up on a shot, be like, do I go low lift point or do I go extended high lift point? And then they butcher it. No, you've practiced it. You have the technique down. You'll just change it based upon what you're feeling.
That's where the biggest difference is in that type of conversations. We're not only talking about you being a great shooter, but a great shot maker.
Yeah.
And being a great shot maker, you have the ability to adapt your lift points and how you shoot it. So you can shoot the medium, you can shoot high, you can shoot extended high, you can even shoot fadeaways. You can get to the point where you can adapt. And Kyrie is probably the most adaptable shooter.
Absolutely. I'd agree.
He can do every type of shot possible. And that allows him, at his height, to take some crazy shots.
Yeah.
Now, before we get into number 3 of just the vague, outdated concepts, I want to combine 1 and 2 really quick about how shooting coaches are ignoring the real player results, and they're only teaching one way to shoot, because to help put this into context, this is happening to NBA players. And the best example that I have is Giannis. When Giannis got to the NBA, he was a good three-point shooter.
A great form.
The form looked good, and his shot percentage wasn't bad. It was his rookie year.
And I think with that form, his shot percentage would have just continued to get better as he adapted to that deeper line.
Exactly, and just giving himself to rep out that form he had.
Yeah.
But someone, or the staff possibly, I don't know who it was, started messing with his shot. And it's probably because they started to notice things that didn't quite follow the rules.
Yep.
The things that if you were to change one thing about Giannis' shot, the easiest answer would be what?
It would be hand placement.
We would change the way he holds the basketball.
Yeah.
And so my guess, if I was to go back in time, what happened to Giannis' shot is that they started moving his hand down, because the rules of shooting is you need to have your guide hand low on the side of the ball.
Yeah.
They might have also said, you know what, your elbow's a little bit out. We're going to go ahead and get that elbow aligned to your hip. And so they start doing these things, and it's no longer comfortable for him. And they try to fit Giannis into the prototypical shooting box, and it doesn't work. And now he spent his whole career trying to restructure everything.
Trying to find what he used to have.
When all they needed to do was to go back to rookie year Giannis.
That's why we always talk about how fun it would be. It's so easy to revert somebody's shot back to once they already had it. It's still in them somewhere. It just got butchered along the way.
And we talk about this all the time. We think that if we had Giannis, we could do it really easily.
Yeah.
It'd be an easy fix.
I honestly don't even know if it would take a day. Like, just fixing something that slight. Like, it might take him a couple days to just get used to it again. But as soon as he feels it that one time, it's like, oh, it's like riding a bike. This is what I used to do.
And I know what people will say, yeah, but everyone said that. But the everyone we're talking about are the prototypical shooting coaches who are all doing the same philosophies. Guide hand really low on the side of the ball, which now Giannis's hands are so big, he doesn't know where to place it.
I still don't know anybody outside of us, maybe like 1 or 2 trainers that I've talked to, that teach fingertips towards the top of the ball, even though almost every good shooter we see is that.
Yeah, all those shooters are just breaking all the rules, and so we can't use them.
Yep.
We're not going to use evidence.
Yep.
But Giannis would be an easy change, and the second one would be Ben Simmons. I feel that everyone's tried to change Ben Simmons' shot, so whether or not he's open to it, I'm not sure. Maybe he's like, you know what, everyone's...
I'm just done with this.
Yeah,
I'm over
everyone's
it.
trying to fix my shot. I'm not even going to mess with it. But it would be so simple, just to slide his offhand up to the top of the ball because he's really low on it.
Make room for his hands.
And when you talk about hands being this big, they can't share space on the bottom side of the ball. And so getting their fingers towards the top of the basketball is such an easy fix. It will loosen up the shoulders, loosen up the elbows.
Feel more secure.
And then it kind of creates a domino effect down the line. So that's where we need to be able to make these adjustments, because the main problem with shooting coaches is that they're trying to fit everybody into the same box.
Absolutely.
And then when someone can't get it, there's no accountability for it. And so, and I'm just going to use this really quick, and then we'll jump to the next part. If we lined up every single NBA player on a line, and we just basically said every single good shooter right here, about 80% of the shooters would shoot the way that would be against the rules.
Yep.
And about 20% or less would be following those guidelines of how to shoot the basketball, of what's being taught. So my question would just always be, why are we teaching everybody to shoot the way only 20% or less are shooting it, rather than starting...
I would say it's even less.
I think it's less, but I'm trying to be nice right now to the shooting coaches. It's even less because it's not comfortable. If I try to fit myself into the way that they're being taught, I try to jam my elbow in, I try to straighten my hand out really early, I try to load my wrist from that position, all while lined up in my right hip, I feel like my shoulder's going to go out of socket. It's not going to fit my body. It's not going to fit most people's bodies. But why wouldn't we teach the way that 80+% of the people are shooting as a starting point? Yeah. Because they're basing it off of philosophy rather than based on how people are comfortable and what's going to fit for most people.
What's effective for
Which flows into number 3, what's wrong with shooting coaches? Vague, outdated concepts. Yeah. So what are the vague, outdated concepps?
I mean, the most common one that I think I even saw a newer trainer post on this the other day was beef. Balance, eyes, elbow, follow through. Which again, it's a very vague statement. Like I get what people are trying to do there. They're trying to find ways to, connect teaching and stuff, but like, okay, number 1, like balance. Balance is one that's very poorly taught. There's several different types of balance. A fadeaway is still balanced, if I mean to do it. Obviously, the most prototypical way they're talking about is, balanced on 2 feet, jump, shoot, land on 2 feet. We still teach that, but then you also have split landings. It's a different level of balance. Shooting off 2 feet, landing on 2 in a split stance. It's all balanced, but I think that's the thing throughout that stuff is like, does that kind of explain shooting in a nutshell, I guess? But if I told a player, like, hey, I want you to have beef when you shoot this next one, balance, eyes, elbow, follow through, and they knew nothing about shooting, none of that helps them whatsoever.
Bryce, why don't you ask me how you beat your defender? Go ahead. Ask me how to beat your defender.
How do I beat my defender?
Just go past him.
See, there you go.
That's about as much information as beef is giving anyone. So, hey, how do I become a good shooter? Beef. Balance, elbows, eyes, follow through. Easy, done. Like that's the way it's being taught. Yeah. And so the balance, okay, well, let's define what balance means. There's a lot of footwork that goes into shooting. So if you're teaching only one set of footwork, you're already limiting the player.
Yeah.
They need to be able to adapt the footwork. And we could put this in a whole different list.
And the best shooter, even when you think JJ Redick, like I can pull up a million videos where he lands on 1 foot, 2 foot, and split landings. That's what made him such a great shooter. Like it's just again that ability to adapt, and that's not going to ever take away. If I teach a kid how to do a split landing, that doesn't take away from his ability to just land on 2 normal. It gives him the idea that maybe I'm in a position where I can't land on 2, but I still want to shoot a balanced shot. Split landing might just be the way to go. It might just be the angle.
Yeah, and if we had to put it on the list, we could in another episode, is that shooting is not footwork. It's not footwork first. Footwork is very much involved, but it's an upper body action, which we have to go to a whole different time to get into. And so we're trying to teach everyone one set of footwork of trying to pick the, once again, optimal footwork to shoot a basketball rather than teaching them a bunch of footwork that they can basically just adapt to. I think adaptability goes into the same thing. What's another vague, outdated concept?
I mean, another vague, outdated one would be, and this can still apply to some players, but the shooting out of the phone booth. So I just had a player here today that I had to help. She plays Division I. She was a great shooter. And if you look at her high school shot, she was not shooting out of a phone booth. Now, for some reason now, her follow through straight up in the sky, almost barely in front of her face. Now she feels like she can't hit a shot because now that transfer of energy, as people like to call it, is no longer going towards their target. If we watch, Steph, Dame, Clay, all these guys are great shooters. Their follow through is actually pretty low. They're aiming at their target. But again, that's where I would say most players we get, their follow through is too high. They're aiming at the ceiling because they were probably once maybe too flat, and then people are like, no, you got to get a higher release. You got to get that thing up. So there's so many of those concepts that they've just become a blur versus we use so much video, we use so many pictures that to players, once they see it, they're like, oh yeah, that kind of, I just did it with one of my NBA guys. His shot kind of fell apart a little bit after an injury. We just started looking at old pictures of himself of when he felt good. This comes back to Giannis. All we got to do is take Giannis, show you old pictures of yourself, new pictures of yourself, blend it together. We'll have you fixed quick.
You can do this. You already had it.
Yeah, you already had it. So, but I think those are the concepts. Another concept, 10 toes at the rim. That's fine sometimes. But there's going to be much more times where we watch players, they're turning. And the reason they're turning is we shoot more off the right side of our body as righties than we do as lefties.
Well, and that's the main issue that I have with rules in general is that they're situational. I don't care if you... Let's say it is more comfortable for you to be 10 toes to the basket. You're not going to get there when driving to the right elbow as a right-handed shooter. What are you going to get there? Quickly turn your feet? You can't always get there. And that's an even bigger problem if you're always teaching turned.
Yeah.
If I have to always teach turned and then I'm driving right, what are you going to? I'm going to completely flip my feet all the way around before I can turn the basketball.
A lot of times it comes back to the concept we talked on a couple of podcasts ago is where people are trying to the addition by subtraction. You do this, but we need to completely take that away and only do this. And you just start locking players up. These players that we love so much, they shoot with such freedom. They're not thinking about their elbows. They're just shooting the ball at this point. And maybe through the beginning there was a thought process in it and stuff. But like you said, most of the time that we see really great shooters, they're not shooting anything like they were taught. And then we get players that man, I've had a shooting coach forever. I've been going through this shooting program. You can almost, and again, not taking shots at trainers, I can almost watch the way a young player is shooting right now, and I know who they're watching. Because, certain things are tied to certain trainers. There are certain trainers that are specifically teaching X, Y, and Z. We have a player come train with us that's following their program, and I'm having to kind of undo some things because they're just not shooting in a way that, one, looks good, and two, has any functionality to it.
And I've yet to have anybody, once again, I'm not trying to take the shot, but we're fixing a lot of these things. I've yet to have someone who's a good shooter that I'm you follow that system. Or that we find out, it's usually that they're not finding success. They're following a shooting program or they're even seeing a shooting coach.
Yeah.
And we can tell right away, this is why you're not a good shooter. And then we show them the trends and we get them just to change a couple little things and all of a sudden they're comfortable. And that's a whole different thing is you can fix someone's shot in just a day or two.
Absolutely.
It doesn't take thousands and thousands and thousands of reps because all we're doing is just creating good fluid movement for
the most
body.
part we've seen it. It's just getting to a player to commit to 20 reps. Any change in shooting, any small change feels disgusting for 5 reps. Even if you were in a weird shot and I gave you good form, you'd be like, this just feels strange. But 20 shots, that stuff is fixed so quick.
Yeah, I think the elbow is the final one that would be we could talk about the gap
getting
myth.
That thing vertical.
But I just want to quickly address the elbow alignment that we're seeing. Mm-hmm. So I can picture the drill that you roll the ball up your body. Yep. It's called the roll-ups. And what that's doing is just trying to get everyone to shoot the ball from that right hip alignment.
Yeah.
And so in order to do that also, you have to get your fingers straight to the basket early too.
Yep.
Now the problem is if I try to keep my fingers straight, and I mentioned this earlier, and I try to load my wrist, and I try to tuck my elbow, my body can't do that.
Yeah, it's already feeling very tight.
And if I try to move the ball, because a lot of people aren't comfortable shooting from their right side anyway, if I try to move the ball to the middle, and I try to still keep my fingers straight towards the basket, and I try to load my wrist, I can't even keep my hand on the basketball.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times because we're following one outdated rule, like I have to tuck my elbow, kids can't even load their wrists.
Yeah.
And so loading the wrist is not hard. And so why are so many players struggling with loading their wrist? Because they're doing other things that don't work. where if you just put the ball in the more so middle of your body to start with, and you just place your hand on the basketball, you're going to have no problem.
It's funny, that's where your
wrist.
hands meet each other. So
Right.
just let them meet.
And if I move the ball from the middle to my right hip and I keep my hands the same, I'll still be plenty loaded.
Yeah.
But the problem is if you follow one of these vague, outdated concepts and it doesn't work for your body, then you have a mess.
You're going to have a hard time.
All the way through.
I agree.
And so that's the main problem with shooting coaches right now.
Yep.
Is that we're not seeing them actually base things off of real basketball players. They're teaching just one way to shoot, which are basically just based on their own philosophies. Yep. And those made up philosophies are really based off of vague, outdated concepts. Did we sum all that up?
Some of it, but I'm sure we're going to have more episodes on shooting because there's so much we could talk about.
And I will follow up real quickly with saying we are not here trying to bash people.
Yeah.
We're talking about concepts. People can represent concepts and can feel like their feelings get hurt. We're not bashing them, but
because we like most of these guys as people. Like, that's the thing. We've had great conversations with some of them.
Yeah, and we're not trying to start any type of war or anything like that. But what we are saying is that I would like them to come to the table and actually say what they're basing these philosophies off of. Which players, because you can't just say all the players that we're seeing don't count.
Yeah.
I want you to say, I'm basing my shooting philosophy off of this particular type of player. Give me like 5-6 examples.
Yeah.
You know, the same way I would say people were talking about the shooting gap is who would they be able to use as their example of that? Peja Stojakovic?
Yeah.
Like, is he going to be your role model for shooting? Because that'd be a tough one to teach everybody.
Yeah.
So I want you to basically say, here's my teaching philosophy, and here's the group of players that I can base this off of, because we can do that.
Yeah.
We can take a really good list of players and say they fit these principles that we're teaching.
Yeah.
But that wraps up what's wrong with shooting coaches. We're going to go more into this as time goes on. Not trying to be divisive, just trying to talk about these concepts. But we will see you again next week for another episode of Dream Loudly.